What is the appeal of crime simulators? It's a question a lot of people have wondered about. It's kind of weird when you get right down to it. I don't agree with the idea that these games inspire violence or somehow convince people that robbing stores and running over pedestrians is good and fun. That's not how it works. But it is interesting that so many people, including myself, find joy in it anyway, doing things that I would never dare to do or even be capable of doing in real life. Why is this such a ubiquitous genre? If we aren't all secret sociopaths looking for a digital outlet for our depravity, which I don't think we are, then why? What is the appeal of playing as a violent, murderous sociopath? Saints Row 2 may just be the key to finding that answer, because it's one of the best, most representative games in the genre, while also having one of the most violent and sadistic heroes of all of them. I love Saints Row 2. It's by far my favourite Saints Row game and one of my top games of all time. And if you know me and my brand, that's kind of weird. I'm not a very edgy guy. I don't even drink alcohol. And I never like playing as bad guys. I've never been able to do a full renegade run of Mass Effect because I just don't like being mean to people. This is a game where you play as an absolute cold-blooded maniac who's driven by nothing more than a lust for more and more power and money. Sounds like a bad guy. Sounds kind of mean. They are mean. So why do I like the game? I have spent actual years trying to figure this out. A few years ago, I made a video about the strange endings of Saints Row 3, and in that video, I joked about making a video about Saints Row 2 next. That had been my intention, but I stopped writing the script halfway through because I couldn't figure out the answer to this question. Playa, now evolved into the boss in this game, may just be one of the most, if not the most complex character in any open-world crime simulator, more complex even than some RPGs, and that makes them incredibly hard to analyse. But I'll try my best. Saints Row 2 is, more than anything else, a sequel. It's everything you want in a sequel. It's bigger, better, and pretty much the same game again, with one major exception. Your character speaks now. They speak a lot, and that is a change with much larger consequences than you can possibly imagine. So let's talk about Saints Row 2. Let's talk about perfecting a formula. It's been 5 years since the events of Saints Row, and a lot has changed. Way more than seems possible in 5 years, frankly, but it's fine. It turns out that the explosion on the yacht didn't kill you, but instead put you in a coma, and you've been slowly recovering in a prison infirmary since then. This is also how the game explains why you can look entirely different between games. Your face has been surgically recreated from scratch, although it doesn't explain how you can switch gender, because yes, you can play as a woman in this game, which I think technically speaking makes this the first game ever with a transgender protagonist, but let's just say I'm hesitant to give Saints Row 2 full credit on that one given the circumstances. It does make the joke about changing your hair much funnier if you do though.
Hey, you look different. You do something with your hair?
This is one of the things that makes Saints Row 2 really weird in the wider world of crime simulators though. It's a sequel that follows the same character in the same city. GTA, Mafia, and Watch Dogs are all games in the same genre, but all of their sequels pivot to a new character and a new setting between games. And there's obvious reasons to do that. Common wisdom says that players will get bored if you have the same city twice, that you'll get accused of laziness for not moving to a new setting. And generally, this is the genre of long stories, where a character's entire life will be shown in game, and really there's no reason to follow their story after the game is over. They may show up again in a future installment, but in a much diminished role. Their story is over. Not so for Saints Row 2. It's a choice that has a lot more power than you may expect because of how it allows the game to build on the previous one, and not just in the story and game mechanics, but in the actual open world itself. But we're not there yet. We're in an island prison. Within about 10 seconds of waking up, you meet a kid named Carlos, and with your newfound power of speech, mount an escape attempt from the prison, which ends with a machine gun-laden boat escape. It's a very different opening to Saints Row 1, significantly more action-packed, a trend that's going to continue throughout the whole game. Carlos explains the many changes that have happened since the first game. The Saints are gone, and 3 new gangs have taken over the city. Julius and Dex have disappeared, Johnny Gat is in jail, and Troy? Well, he's now the chief of police. Even more important, Saints Row itself is gone. Far from the downtrodden district it was before, it's now the most modern and glamorous part of the city, transformed by the Ultor Corporation into a corporate paradise of clean streets and glass towers. Everything you accomplished in the first game, reset. So, time to do it again. Only this time, you're not going to be the lackey. You're going to be the boss. In terms of gameplay and story progression, Saints Row 2 is exactly the same as Saints Row 1, though they did mercifully include a good driving scheme this time. The game is structured in exactly the same way, where after the prologue it splits into 3 different campaigns that can be played in any order. It has the same respect system, requiring that you play the side activities and stays true to the everything matters philosophy of game design. Saints Row 2 is not a sequel of evolution. That'll come later. Saints Row 2 is a sequel of refinement. Every activity, every element of gameplay from the first game has been looked at, re-examined and improved. There's basic changes, you can aim down sights now and turn on cruise control in cars, but the bigger changes are to the side activities and the customization. Side activities in the first game were mandatory but could sometimes feel more like chores than fun. So this game implements a ton of small tweaks that massively improve the experience. Every activity has been shortened from 8 levels to 6, and the rewards have been doubled, from 1 reward on completion to a reward at half and full completion, and another reward when all instances of a side activity have been completed. Each activity type has been reduced from 3 instances to 2, but more variation in activities has been added to compensate. And there's more to do overall. Activities that were boring, like carjacking, have been removed, and activities that were on the fence have been streamlined or reworked to make them much more fun, such as the addition of the adrenaline system to insurance fraud, which lets you turn down gravity a bit. Hitman has been reworked entirely to make it actually playable, changing it from a weird waiting game with the game's spawning system to an actual hunt with specific triggers to make targets appear. This is a pile of small changes and refinements that contributes to making these activities significantly more enjoyable. The more consistent drip feed of unlockables makes the activities feel much more worthwhile even if you have the respect you need for the next mission already, especially since the rewards themselves are, on the whole, better than they were in the first game, including things like high tier guns and infinite ammo. Customization has been altered to keep it in the core loop, but to allow more player freedom. Instead of a respect modifier based on the price and colour of the clothes, the style bonus is now a modifier that builds simply by spending money on things, be it clothes, cars, or customising the several buyable cribs around the map. It's interesting that Saints Row 1 and 2 both generally get labelled as more realistic than the future titles, and while that's true to some extent, both of the games wear their artificial and arcadey elements with pride. Saints Row 2 doesn't shy away from it, it embraces it even more with side activities that are weirder and sillier than the last game, like trailblazing where you drive around on an on-fire quad bike in a path of destruction. There's also crowd control where you work as a bodyguard throwing harassers into bizarre deaths for bonus points. Or my personal favourite, Septic Avenger, where you take control of a turreted sewage truck to literally coat public and private property in sewage. Beyond even that, the game also has several almost secret activities to do that also come with their own rewards. If you get in an ambulance, you can start working as an EMT in what the game calls a diversion. And there's also diversions for taxi driving, firefighting, tow trucking, and sex work. Saints Row 2's particular arcadiness doesn't work for everyone, but if you have a completionist mindset like me, then this stuff is highly addictive. A drip feed of unlockable rewards is exactly my jam, and because there's so much variation in activities, there's never any feeling of the grind like a lot of other open world games can fall into. The basic gameplay of shooting and driving is fine, serviceable, but with this level of gamification and variation on top of it, Saints Row 2 is the ultimate curated sandbox experience. All of these open world crime simulators are predicated on the idea that sometimes you just want to spread a little chaos and mayhem. They're designed to have worlds where running over pedestrians doesn't bother you because it's obvious that they aren't real people, they're little polygon men. But Saints Row is the only series I can think of that takes that impulse and actually incorporates it into the structure of the game itself. You can just dick around with a rocket launcher on the street, or you can do the mayhem activity and get money and a resistance to explosion damage for good measure. Saints Row 1 was doing this as well, obviously, but Saints Row 2 amps it up in all the right ways, refining the experience to its absolute peak. But there's a reason most of these games don't do this, because another piece of common wisdom is that the more you gamify the gameplay, the less invested and the less important the story becomes. To which Saints Row 2 replies, if ramping up everything else with this layer of gamey silliness, why not just do that to the story as well, in all directions? Saints Row 2 is at the same time darker, more serious, and grittier than the first game, while also being much sillier and much more blatantly video gamey. That sounds like it shouldn't work, but it actually works surprisingly well. Saints Row 2 simply commits 100% to its weird world, where we as an audience can recognise the absurdity of the things that happen, but the characters take everything seriously, which lends the game a strange sincerity. You'll get into a sword fight with a gang of motorbike riding sword ninjas, but the game will never make a single joke about that. It is 100% serious about the threat of the sword ninja bikers, and in a post-MCU world where everything is quoted in a level of irony, it's actually very strange to see. All three of the new gangs are like that. It's actually a bigger pivot from Saints Row 1 than most people give it credit for. They don't fall into typical gang archetypes like the previous generation. They're much stranger. There's the Ronin, the aforementioned sword bike ninjas led by Shogo Okuji, a guy who looks and sounds like a shonen protagonist because he's voiced by Yuri Lowenthal, aka Sasuke Uchiha.
Listen, Junichi. I know you're having a hard time adjusting to the way I run things here. But how about you let me deal with my father, and you deal with whatever the fuck I tell you to deal with?
Sometimes casting really is just perfect. The Brotherhood of Stillwater, who control the bottom half of the map, are a gang of heavy metal loving, truck driving, tatted up muscle men led by the biggest and tattooedest of them all, Maro, a guy whose voice is even better because he's voiced by Worf.
You really think that a couple of washed-up bangers like you and Gat have a chance against the Brotherhood?
And finally, there's the Sons of Sandy, a Caribbean drug cartel with voodoo influences led by a mysterious guy known only as the General. He's voiced by... well, either Greg Eagles or Dave Fennoy. Both are credited with the role on IMDb, but Dave Fennoy is actually in the credits of Saints Row 2 and Greg Eagles isn't, and to my ears it sounds like Dave Fennoy. He has a very distinct voice.
My friends, please be civil. Veteran child, look into the matter of the missing money. If one of your bag boys is indeed alive, take one of his hands. I doubt he will be late again.
Dave Fennoy is also a much more prolific voice actor, especially at the time, so I'm like 90% sure it's him, but it's weird that we don't know for sure, right? This is totally irrelevant to the video, I'm moving on now. Each of these gangs is once again taken down with the help of a lieutenant. For the Ronin, it's Pierce, a wannabe gangster who's smarter than he looks and much less confident than he acts. For the Sandy, it's Shondi, a hippie stoner and serial dater who's equally much smarter than she looks. And for the Brotherhood, it's Carlos, the small boy who helped you escape prison. And of course, Johnny Gat's back too, this time as your second in command after you help him shoot his way out of a death sentence. The lieutenants are recruited in the weirdest way possible considering how important they are to the rest of the franchise. A single mission where you do a small thing to impress them. Carlos at least makes sense because you already know him from the prison escape, but for Pierce it's shoot 7 Ronin and for Shondi it's do 3 car jumps. When that's done with, the boss gets up and does the exact same speech that Julius gave back in the first game, a tradition that will last through every game, for some reason.
Aight. Once we're done here, talk to one of these guys. They'll have something for you to do. It's our time now. Let's get this shit started.
Unlike Saints Row 1, the content of these stories is less determined by the mission giver than they are by the gang you're fighting. And that's because the dynamic is different. These characters are no longer your boss. They're your advisors. The boss is the one who makes the call, and the boss is rather gung-ho when it comes to taking action. In essence, the entire game has been Johnny Gat-ized. Saints Row 1 was rooted in a very early 2000s gangsta and hip-hop aesthetic that dates the game to a very specific era. Saints Row 2 withdraws heavily from that culture to focus on a more generic action movie style aesthetic. In the first game, there were no non-baggy options. In the second game, the only baggy jeans are DLC, and everyone holds their gun upright now. It's a well-considered change. Backing away from that culture may give the game less personality in the wider game world, but it also gives it more general appeal. The Saints are still dressed in a typical street gang type way, but from this game onwards they are also customizable, allowing you to make the Saints as silly as the gangs you're fighting. It also means we're no longer straying into territory that the developers clearly don't actually know much about. Every mission is designed with a cool action movie moment in mind, be it raiding a casino, torching a drug farm with a helicopter machine gun, or escaping the police in a narrow and dark cave. It's this action movie focus that the franchise would keep going forward, but where most of the rest of the games aim for a blockbuster aesthetic, Saints Saints Row 2 is aiming lower, more like those low-budget B-movies where they're a bit weirder and a bit rougher around the edges, where fighting ninjas was a common occurrence for some reason. Along with this cultural shift, the game has also shifted into a slightly more inclusive, slightly less crass direction. There's some dodgy stereotyping going on with the rival gangs, particularly the Ronin's daddy issues, which fall into some well-trodden stereotypes about stern and disappointed Asian fathers. But for the most part, the game has a less deliberately offensive South Park vibe than the first game, especially when it comes to women. As previously mentioned, you can play as a woman now, which is a big improvement already. The player character is never explicitly gendered by the script, except by themselves and some ambient dialogue that's exclusive to the voice you pick. But that also means a female boss cannot fall into any stereotypes. They've been written from a neutral perspective. If you don't play as a woman, then Saints Row 2 technically has less women than the first game, with only 3 women as part of the main story. But while it has less women, it has more female characters. They've been given significantly more development that actually brings them up to par with their male counterparts, with the possible exception of Aisha, who's much the same as she was in the first game, even though she looks like Halle Berry now. The other character besides Shondi, who we'll get to, is Jessica, Maro's girlfriend, and in total contrast to Luz in the first game, she's a girlfriend character done correctly. She isn't defined by her relationship, it's important of course, but she has a definable personality and a place in the story outside of it. She's both his girlfriend and a lieutenant of the gang for one, and she has a personality that can't be neatly boiled down into a stereotype. She's soft and friendly while also being vindictive and cruel. I mean, she is a villain. She even manages to kill one of the Saints' lieutenants, albeit indirectly. Shondi is the real star though. She's a white girl with dreads, sure, but it's a step up in terms of character writing from anything in the first game. On paper, she could be a disaster. Her whole deal is that she gets all the information on the gangs from ex-boyfriends. But in execution, she's not a sexualized disaster like Tanya from the first game. And outside of a few egregious camera shots, the game never objectifies her or even really judges her for being so sexually active. Pierce makes a couple of comments about it, but they're clearly meant to be understood as an extension of his own insecurities rather than a condemnation of Shondi.
I'm just saying, don't bitch unless you got a solution.
Guys.
My solution is to do more than wait around for one of the 600 guys Shonda used to fuck to give us a call.
There's a bunch of helicopters dropping cargo over Samdi territory.
How the hell you know that? Gotta be fucking kidding me.
She falls much more into hippie stoner archetypes with a chill, easy breezy approach to everything, which is a trope, but typically a male trope, so even just applying it to a woman is new and somewhat subversive. She does get damseled twice, which is a gendered cliche, but at the same point in other storylines, Carlos gets killed, Johnny Gat gets impaled, and Aisha is decapitated, so it's hard to say that the game is exploiting her more than it's hitting a general story beat. She's less of a fighter than the likes of Gat, but the game never treats her lesser because of it. She brings plenty of other skills to the table. Shondi is a great character. She's complex, multi-layered, and brings an interesting dynamic to the game. I'm sure nothing could happen to change that. Why, you'd basically have to make her an entirely different person to do that. There's still problems, obviously. Snatch is still in the game, even if the language has been altered to make it less horribly objectifying, and in general the game still has a bad habit of treating sex work as a joke in of itself. But overall, it's a drastic improvement from the first game. The game even passes the Bechdel test. A+ if you're playing as a woman, but even if you're not, we've got one scene where Jessica almost hits Shondi with a car, so C+. It's a passing grade. They even managed to partially redeem Luz. She comes back in the game as one of the drug traffickers, having been dumped by the drug lord for a younger woman, which means she actually does something other than obsess over men in shoes. There's actually several returning characters from the first game, often in very odd roles. Laura and Tobias, 2 of the drug traffickers from the first game, appear as part of the Samdi storyline. Mr. Wong, one of the hitman mission givers and an unlockable homie, comes back in the Ronin storyline, and Donnie, the softboy mechanic, is back working for the Brotherhood this time. It's representative of another trait of the franchise we'll be maintaining going forward: rigorous commitment to continuity. Everything, no matter how small and obscure, matters, and will probably be referenced again later. Some of these characters are better integrated than others, but each story unfolds in a similar way with different flavours for each gang. They reach a deadly escalation of back and forth between you and a rival gang. With the Brotherhood, that's at its most direct, with the boss in a personal rivalry with Maro. It actually starts off cordially. Maro wishes to enter a truce with the Saints and let them in on a deal at an 80-20 split. The boss takes that as an insult and everything escalates from there. You put radioactive waste in his tattoo ink, he murders one of your lieutenants. You murder his girlfriend, he leads an assault on your entire district, so on and so forth. The scene where Carlos dies may be one of the most iconic moments in the game, and it's a weird one. As a kid, when I first played this game, I remember it being an incredibly deep emotional moment. Replaying it now, it's a very atonal element within the rest of the game. Carlos isn't a super developed character since he dies really early in the game, but what you do know about him is that he's a good kid trying his best. In this completely wordless scene, he's been bloodied beyond recognition after being dragged face down behind a truck. The boss tries to get him loose, but it's not happening. So instead, they shoot him dead out of mercy. It's such a bleak story beat. As mentioned, Aisha dies at the same point in the Ronin story, but there the moment is played in a more action movie style. We don't even see the body, just a dramatic shot of some rose heads hitting the floor. Here, we really linger on the moment and every detail of it. It's the kind of moment that's quite hard to jump from straight into playing a few rounds of the fun cop show parody where you chainsaw guys in pirate costumes. But that's part of this game's weird world. Everything is extruded. The comedy and the tragedy. I've been struggling to figure out how I feel about this scene, and I think I've come down on thinking that it's a step too far. Saints Row 2 is a game built for many things, but I don't think it's built for a scene like this. Not in the game where you can call a voodoo place to get him brought back as a zombie right after it happens. The boss is not a character designed to hold this kind of emotional weight. Sure, it looks fine if your boss looks normal, the scene holds most of its intended emotion, but if you make your boss look like a Mr. Blobby Gajinka, then suddenly everything seems a bit ridiculous. The game is much better when it's doing the opposite, hitting exceptionally silly beats and treating them completely seriously. Like Mr. Sunshine, a lieutenant of the Sons of Samedi and a voodoo shaman who actually uses a voodoo doll to toss you around the room during his boss fight. This is silly, ridiculous even, but the game takes it 100% seriously, even when it becomes a slapstick moment where he just won't stay dead no matter how many bullets are put into him. No one makes a joke about that, they just come up with a practical solution. The whole game operates on B action movie logic. It doesn't have to make sense, it doesn't have to be explained, it just has to be awesome, and any good action set piece needs a good set. The true star of Saints Row 2 is Stillwater, which is one of the best open world cities in game history. Not because it's realistic, it's easily one of the least realistic, but exactly because it's so artificial. It has more variety than any other city I've seen. Every single district feels completely unique in colour, architecture, vibe, and even the people and cars you see in it. Stillwater is nothing like Los Santos or Liberty City, where the city is supposed to be emulating a real city. Instead, it's like a condensed amalgamation of every American city, hitting all of the tropes and all of the beats it needs to give the impression of different classically American moments. The power of Stillwater isn't in the details, though there are plenty of secrets and Easter eggs to find. The power is in its ability to serve as an incredibly intricate playground and setting for everything you're doing. The world map is full of landmarks, and every single one of them will be used in a mission at one point or another. This pocket approach also makes navigation easy. You can get your bearings by just looking at the surrounding architecture, orienting yourself that way without even needing to look at the map. This was true of the first game as well, but like everything else, the sequel has massively improved on it, adding even more varied districts and enhancing the ones we've already seen. You're based in the Red Light District, of which there's two sides. There's the fancy, cleaned up waterfront, and then the seedy, graffiti-ridden ghetto behind it. To the west, there's the Apartments District, a middle-class area of nice but small apartment complexes, and then further again you'll hit Stillwater University, an entire campus as well as student accommodation. Come back down and you'll hit Chinatown, which is self-explanatory, then the Barrio, the Spanish Quarter, also self-explanatory. Head north and you'll hit the other island, the Upper Class Island. On one half is the suburbs, big, fancy detached houses and mansions, complete with a large cemetery. But tucked in the corner is a small dusty trailer park as well. Then, as you drive east, you'll hit the city centre, packed with skyscrapers and government buildings, as well as parks. Specifically the very north, which is home to the marina, a hotspot for casinos and hotels, and the museum district, complete with a scale recreation of the Greek pantheon. Just above the Barrio is the factory district, haphazardly placed smokestacks and corrugated steel, and finally we get to Saints Row, which is perfectly awful. It's an entire corporate district, pre-planned, gleaming roads covered with security and Ultor logos on every street corner. It hits an almost dystopian note as you enter it. The road actually has a sharp quality increase as soon as you enter the region. It's the only district that doesn't have police, but instead you're pursued by Ultor's private security. The real downtown is believably sprawling, like it evolved over decades, but Saints Row feels pre-planned. Everything in the area meticulously thought out is to be as aesthetically pleasing as possible for the millionaires who live there. You can't ever take Saints Row. It, along with the prison and the nuclear plant, are totally free of gang violence. It will always remain a hostile place for scum like you. Ultor is woven into the story in interesting ways. Their CEO, Dane Vogel, is one of those classically charming and scheming billionaire types that are just oh so punchable. Ultor has connections with the Ronin, but when old Manakuji cuts those ties, Vogel sells them out to the Saints. Why? Unclear, but he's clearly working towards his own agenda. He also gets threatened by Maro to help some of his men escape prison, but turns the table next time with a small army of well-armed commandos. They represent a very different threat to any of the gangs. Bigger, vastly more powerful, and nebulous. Dane Vogel may be in charge, but it's a structured corporation. There are hundreds of people who could take his place. So of course, Ultor is the surprise final villain. After all three gangs have been defeated, Vogel gives a press conference where he reveals his plans. Use the gangs, meaning you, to destabilise Sunnyville, the region where your base is, and then pump money into the police and wipe them all out, paving the way to expand the Saints Row project, turning more of the city into a corporate paradise. So, before you have a chance to celebrate your victory, you and the rest of the Saints are ambushed by the corporate commandos. Over the course of the climactic missions, you'll end up raiding and destroying one of their secret underground laboratories and massacring a yacht full of their executives before finally ending the game by killing Vogel himself. It's an interesting note to end the game on. It's victorious, but also obviously temporary. Vogel will just as easily be replaced by some new ambitious guy in a suit who'll no doubt be up to more schemes. In fact, the newspaper clipping at the end of the mission even says as such. It sets up the potential for a very different sequel with some very strange world building for a game about gang wars. Because here's the other strange fact about Ultor. They didn't originate in Saints Row, they're actually a carryover from another of Volition's franchises, a little series you might have heard of called Red Faction. It's the Ultor Corporation and the first Red Faction game who owns Mars, and Saints Row 2 actually does a surprising amount of world building to suggest that the Ultor in this game and the Ultor on Mars are in fact the same Ultor. Ultor is clearly way more than a regular corporation. They're a mega corporation, with their hands in everything. Saints Row is the very beginnings of a dystopian cyberpunk future where the planet is handed over to mega corporations, drained of its resources, and those rich enough to not care move to Mars to begin a new society. It's a bit of an irrelevant connection now given the direction that the franchise ended up in, but it's an undeniable part of this game nonetheless, and an angle that the DLC explores even more. The Saints can fight many things. They can even fight Ultor, but Ultor won't fall just because you kill the big boss. Speaking of big bosses, I think it's time we talk about the boss. Saints Row 2 and all of the mainline Saints Row games going forward have the strangest customization system I've ever seen. A while back when talking about Mass Effect and FemShip, I made the totally accurate and extremely useful protagonist scale from Mafia to Fallout New Vegas. On the Mafia end are characters completely outside of your control. Tommy Angela's story and personality is pre-written. You cannot change it or shape it in any way, only play it out in the way that the game was intended. The courier from Fallout New Vegas is entirely yours. You decide how they look, what their skills are, and what words they speak, from the options provided anyway. Commander Shepard is somewhere in the middle. Their appearance is changeable and their personality can be shaped, but there are also fundamental truths about the character that cannot be altered. The boss, on the other hand, the boss is an outlier that breaks my perfect chart. The boss is fully customizable, even down to the way they walk, leaning towards New Vegas, but they have a completely predefined personality and a story that you cannot shape. Well, that's not entirely accurate. They have 6 personalities to choose from, each of which is distinct, almost a different character, but still the same at the same time. I don't know any other game that does this. The closest I can think of is something like Dragon Age Inquisition, which has 4 voices to choose from, but Inquisition is an RPG which still gives you a large amount of control over the Inquisitor's personality. If it were just different voices, that would be one thing. Cutscene dialogue is always the same, even if the delivery can give it a slightly different tone. Outside of the cutscenes though, voices have different lines, which can give the character an entirely different vibe altogether. Example, I normally play the game with male voice 1, because he sounds like this.
Fuck off. Fuck off.
Male voice 1 is an intensely serious and dour figure with a real malice to his tone. Here's an example from the mission where Shaundi has been kidnapped by a guy called Veteran Childs.
It's hard to find good help these days.
Oh shit.
Yeah, I was surprised too.
Fuck me.
Spin your favourite record because when I find you, you're a dead man.
can't be fucking happening.
No, you better believe it is, veteran child.
This playthrough I decided to go with one I hadn't played before, Female Voice 2, who's very different. She's still very intense, all of them are, but she's generally a lot more sarcastic and jokey around things instead of dangerous and threatening.
You sure know how to show a girl a good time.
Oh shit.
What do you say we go on a second date?
Fuck me.
Ooh, I got an idea. How about I meet you at your place?
Can't be fucking happening.
Meet you at On Track? Yeah, that sounds great.
And just for fun, rule of threes.
So, you're at On Track, huh?
Oh shit.
I always thought it was kinda a shitty nightclub, but hey, who am I to judge?
Fuck me.
I want you to know that I'm coming for you, veteran child, and when I get there, I'm putting a bullet in your worthless skull.
This can't be fucking happening.
See you soon, sweetie.
These aren't just different lines, they're different conversations that make the boss extremely nebulous to analyse. I could talk specifically about my boss, the one I played the game with, but that alienates everyone who didn't play the game with Female Voice 2. This approach completely blurs the lines between player creation and preset character. It's like an exclusive preset character just for you. The broad strokes are the same, the actions taken in the game are always the same, but the flavour can be quite different. I'm not trying to make this sound like a bad thing, it's a curiosity to be sure, and one that has some interesting benefits. You have that personal connection to your boss, but unlike a fully player-created character, they still have a defined personality that you still feel partial ownership of because you chose it. No matter what personality you pick, however, the boss is not a good person. The immutable facts are that they are a sociopathic killing machine driven by nothing more than a lust for power and pure avarice. Over the course of this game, you participate in a lot of very cruel things. Having Maro kill his own girlfriend, the aforementioned radioactive tattoo, burning another Brotherhood lieutenant's guitar hand so he can never work again, forcing Donnie to plant bombs on his gang's cars, the part where you torture a junkie for information, burying Shogo Akuji alive, making old man Akuji scream into a phone for you, and, oh yeah, executing Julius. They enjoy the violence, enjoy the torture, and it all happens because of them. None of this would be happening if they just decided to open a restaurant. They wanted to start a gang for the power. In the first game, the Saints had noble intentions. Julius formed the gang to put an end to the rest of the gangs in the city, take them down in ways the cops never would because the cops were corrupt. There's no noble intentions in this game, it's pure greed. It's perfectly encapsulated by the boss rejecting Maro's deal. Maybe an 80-20 split isn't fair, but if you do that mission early in the game, then the Saints really are nothing at that point. The boss didn't reject it because it was an unfair business deal. They rejected it because they're greedy. These are all the reasons I shouldn't like this game. I don't like being the bad guy, and in Saints Row 2, you're definitely not the good guy. You're the player. The traits I just mentioned seem like a monster, but they're the same traits that apply to any game when you get right down to it. We're all here because we enjoy the violence, that's why we play shooters. It's compelling to shoot people. Saints Row 2 just bridges that gap and makes that joy a part of the story. The player's journey in a lot of games is to murder your way to the top and make a big pile of money, but in most games that's obfuscated by a plot about saving the world or stopping an evil villain. Saints Row 2 just manifests that drive into a character, the boss, and makes it a character who acts like you always acts. It's not critique necessarily, the game isn't pulling a Far Cry 5 and insinuating that all of the violence is your fault. It's more the opposite, giving you an excuse to enjoy the violence without feeling so bad about it. Anything you do, no matter how weird or how violent, is in character for the boss. They love it, you love it, so there's no friction in the story between the two of you. I generally find pure just messing around really boring. That's why I don't last long in GTA Online. I like structure, I like things to do, and if that's the way you want to play it, then the boss will accommodate. When doing the activities this time around, a lot of the more ridiculous ones are shown to be the boss's idea. I understand the impulse to paint this enjoyment of violence as a warning sign. That's why most games would never make love of violence such a front and centre theme like this. But instead of regarding the fact that so many people do find enjoyment in a game like this with suspicion, I want to explore why it's so normal. Nobody views the pedestrians in Central or GTA or Forza for that matter as real people. They're toys, action figures that have a little bit more motion than a normal figurine. I have a ton of Lego figures with guns, but I don't think you'd judge a kid for pretending that the little Lego battle droids are shooting the little Lego stormtroopers. Violence is fun, it's exhilarating, it's a thrill that hopefully most of us never actually have to face in real life. You would never mug someone in the street in real life, you'd certainly not find any joy in doing it if you were forced into that situation, but we make these games and we tell these stories because there's a certain thrill that comes from acting so against the norms of society. You aren't really breaking the rules when you commit crimes in Saints Row, the game fully facilitates your crime sprees, but the game successfully captures the rush of committing crimes. It's escapism, a more broad escapism than being a space marine or a race car driver, but escapism nonetheless. I don't think it's any weirder an impulse than a horror movie. Nobody really wants to be chased through narrow corridors by scary monsters, but it's an experience, something new, something different, something fundamentally fun. It's not that the story is unimportant to Saints Row 2, the story is the framework that facilitates this open freedom, gives it structure, and some especially cool moments that you couldn't recreate in a true sandbox. And it's very good at it, delivering some genuinely great moments of both spectacle and character. I haven't brought him up much in this video, but I love Pierce. He's equally as depthful as Shawnee and has some of the most human moments in the game, like fighting with the boss over what's on the radio, or his constant jealousy of Shawnee getting the credit for his ideas. Truly meaningless violence isn't that interesting. If Saints Row 2 was released with all of the guns in all of the shops but none of the missions, I don't think it would be regarded as such a classic. It would be an impressive sandbox that most people would bounce off rather quickly. A game like GTA has a nihilistic view towards its violence. Nothing matters. Do what you want. That pedestrian was probably going to die today anyway. Saints Row doesn't engage on that level because it's about smashing your action figures together and making slapstick comedy with the physics engine. It's blatantly artificial in all the right ways. I'm having a deep conversation about violence, but that's not the intended conversation about the game. For all the things that make the boss such a violent sociopath, the game also has moments of extreme levity. The Saints are a believable group. They bicker, they tease each other, they have great banter. The game may have some heavy moments, but the only real emotion it wants to provoke in you for any length of time is fun. A super important feature that I haven't even mentioned yet is that the entire game can be played in co-op. All of the missions and all of the activities are designed to accommodate 2 players, which is common in other genres but extremely uncommon in the open world crime simulator genre, and adds a whole other dimension to the game that I can't really get into. It stands as a shining example of the genre not because of its depth, it doesn't have a story anywhere near as intricate as something like Mafia 2, but because of its breadth. There's so much of it. Everything the designers could possibly think of and more was put into the game. No corner of the map is left unused. Which begs the question, what next? Where do you go from a game that already has so much? Here in the future we can see that there were 2 paths. Saints Row the Third is the one that went forward, but before we moved on to that, we got 2 little glimpses of what could have been.
Hey, thanks for meeting me. I appreciate it.
You kidding me? I'm not passing up a chance to hurt Ultor. What you got for me?
I know about some things Ultor wants to keep buried.
Honey, I got shit to do. I don't have time for poetics.
Hey, who's being poetic? I'm talking about bodies.
Well, why didn't you say so?
Ultor Exposed is the first of these 2 DLC packs, and it's an odd duck to be sure. The gimmick of this DLC is that it stars Tara Patrick, who, if you don't know, is a porn star. Or she was, I think she's retired now, which means, yes, the name of the DLC is an innuendo, but it's also not. It seems like a marketing thing, so they can make the promo artwork look like this. But Tara Patrick's presence in the DLC is itself a direct reference to those old B-movies that the game is based on. They had a habit of casting porn stars in minor roles, often as news anchors or, like here, scientists, with the joke being, she's a porn star, but she's doing a smart thing because porn stars are usually dumb. I said it was based on those films, not that those films have aged well. Here, Tara Patrick the porn star plays Tara Patrick, the microbiologist who used to do dodgy experiments for Ultor but has decided to blow the whistle, coming to you to help make that happen. The whole DLC is aiming even more directly for that 80s movie feel, going up against the evil corporation, exposing their dark secrets. It's only 3 missions long, but they are decently chunky missions, first digging out the bodies of the experiments, then stealing the chemicals that were used to facilitate the experiments. What's much more interesting about the DLC than Tara Patrick's involvement is how it has some much more direct ties to Red Faction. The experiments being done were to improve the lung capacity of miners for mysterious reasons. And even weirder, as you're escaping with the chemicals, Ultor comes after you with EDF scout cars ripped straight out of Red Faction Guerrilla. You even get to keep one as part of the DLC. It's utterly bizarre to see them like this, not just as an Easter egg, but as a full-on part of the DLC's story. They don't mesh with the aesthetic of the game at all. They're about 150 years too early, and they have a big Red Faction logo on the back window, just in case you missed the reference. Here's the big kicker though, this isn't just a random crossover, it's cross-promotion. This DLC came out 2 months before Red Faction Guerrilla. Here in the future, this is just a strange novelty, but for those brief 2 months, this was a tease of the return of a franchise that hadn't seen a release since 2002. I don't know how successful that really was as a cross-promotion. I mean, I love Red Faction Guerrilla, but it's a very different game to this one, and I don't think a porn star is quite the right marketing direction for it. Terra refers to the cars as mining prototypes, which is weird because that's not what they are in Red Faction, they're cop cars. So its links to Red Faction are pretty tenuous despite the direct asset rip. But I have to admit, I just kind of love the idea that Saints Row is a prequel to Red Faction. It's such a strange connection between two franchises that have nothing to do with each other. They're not even set on the same planet, but having the backdrop of a gang game be the beginnings of a dystopian future is just so fun to me. The final beat of the DLC even hits that note once more. Terra secures an interview with Jane Valderrama, another recurring character in the Saints Row series, to run the secret experiment story. But during the interview, Jane spins it to make it look like Terra is the true culprit, not Ultor. She explains that Ultor was going to bury the story anyway. It's not as simple as exposing the company's dark secrets and they'll just disappear in shame. That's not how the world works. At least this way the story gets picked up more and the Saints make more money from it. Terra swears to get her vengeance one day, and that's the last we ever saw of Terra Patrick the microbiologist. This DLC and the next have nothing to do with street gangs whatsoever, which is interesting, especially considering the content of the final DLC.
I wanted to talk to the leader of the Saints.
I wanted some freckled bitches and a blowjob, but I've learned to deal with disappointment. What you need from the Saints?
I need protection.
Along with the epilogue missions against Dane Vogel, there's a secret epilogue mission in the game called Revelations, the one where you shoot Julius. To find it, you need to unprompted go to the police station in Saints Row to find some old wiretaps of Troy's conversations with Julius after his arrest. These eventually lead to you finding Julius working now as a tour guide for the refurbished church of Saints Row. It's a trap, however, laid by the final member of the old gang, Dex, who for some reason lured you here to kill you both. You escape together before killing Julius in revenge for what he did to you. It's a sad scene, probably the most effective in the game. Julius is right about all of it. He never wanted any of this to happen. He just wanted the streets to be safer. But he crossed the boss, so now he has to die. The final DLC, Corporate Warfare, cannot be played until you've completed this mission, because it's all about Dex. Or at least, it's supposedly all about Dex. Corporate Warfare is the end of Saints Row 2, and for some, the end of what they consider to be the real Saints Row before everything went wrong with Saints Row the Third. We'll talk a lot more about that next time. What's so strange about this DLC as a historical artifact, though, is that it's a setup DLC, kind of a primer of what to expect in the next game, like the Arrival DLC for Mass Effect 2. Only this time, it's set up for a sequel that never actually happened. The story revolves around a rivalry between Eric Griffin, the man who took Dane Vogel's job, and Dex, who's looking much older, much more sinister, and is now head of Ultor Security Division. Dex is trying to have Griffin assassinated because he knows about Dex's illegal activities, using company resources for his own gain and so on and so forth. Honestly, it's all a bit vague, but he's doing bad stuff with company money and Griffin wants you to stop him. The boss doesn't care about Griffin, they just want revenge on Dex for trying to have them killed. First you foil his assassination plans, then you foil one of his schemes involving toxic waste. Then the DLC kind of goes off the rails. Dex runs away after the end of Mission 2, and for Mission 3 you take up a sniper position in the marina to, in the words of the boss, kill his people, his friends, his soldiers, his favourite street magician, and despite that seeming like quite a serious vengeance, this mission is played for pure comedy. It features a mime car that spawns endless mimes. It's such a strange note to end the game on, and that's because it was clearly meant to set up things for Saints Row 3, establishing Dex as a villain, establishing Eric Griffin as a schemer clearly up to something. Dex even has an extremely on-the-nose line where he tells you that Eric isn't the man you think he is. This is a short story that was never meant to stand on its own, and yet, It has to. This is the last time we ever saw Eric Griffin, and Dex's next appearance, well, I wouldn't want to spoil it if you don't already know. What's weird is it seems to set up a game that's very, very different to Saints Row 2. A game about corporate espionage and worldwide intrigue. It's not like you could have a third game with 3 more gangs and just have Dex be the head of one of the gangs. That would be unsatisfying. I understand why this open thread irritates people, but I also totally get why they ignored it, because, honestly, I would have done the same. Dex was a great character in the first game, but he holds absolutely no weight as a villain. His motivations are paper thin, and he has barely any screen time. I would not be excited for a game of the boss versus Dex. I suppose if you really want to follow the Ultor branch of Saints Row 2 sequel possibilities, you've just got to play Red Faction. Because of course, the final line of Saints Row 2 is another Red Faction joke.
The Stillwater branch won't have any more unpleasantness with the Saints, will we?
Hey, as long as you don't come after me and mine, you can go to Mars for all I care.
Red Faction Guerrilla isn't on my schedule, but at this rate, maybe it should be. I think corporate warfare is more interesting for what it represents, like a piece of forgotten game history, a potential what if. Actually playing it is a bit underwhelming. If this was the real end of Saints Row, I'd certainly be upset about that too. Saints Row 2 is an excellent game, a true titan among the crime simulator genre, but it's also, with the exception of corporate warfare, an exceptionally finished game. The things that make it great are also what makes it so hard to follow up on. Once you're at the top of Murder Money Mountain, where do you go next? Running a successful gang doesn't exactly have the same drama as starting from the bottom. There's a compelling argument that the story of Saints Row 2 should have ended with Saints Row 2, that these characters should have been ditched, no matter how likeable they are, in favour of a new cast and a new city, climbing up the mountain once more. That didn't happen. At least not until 2022, a full decade and a bit later. What did happen was much, much weirder than anyone could have predicted back in 2009. But that's a story for another day. I expected more pushback from this game like I had with Saints Row 1, but no, this game holds up perfectly. It is a true classic. So, thanks Mum for buying it all those years ago, even though you didn't want to and you swore you would never do it again. Totally worth it.
So what do we do now?
This is our city. We do whatever the fuck we want to do.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my patrons for supporting the things that I do. If you want to see your name up here or get access to some bonus videos, you can find that link in the description down below, as well as a like, a comment, a share, and a subscribe. You can check out the first part of the Saints Row series up here, or if you're looking for something different, you can check out this video on Star Trek Picard Season 3. It's good this time, I promise.